the nominee to make his opening remarks. I just want to make a couple announcements. First of all, for the public who is here, we have all, including the nominee, sat here since 10 in the morning and listened very closely to your public testimony, and thank you very much for providing that input to us. It's very valuable. But now is our opportunity to be hearing from the nominee directly, and then also to be raising our questions to the nominee. So if you're here in the audience, I'm going to ask you to please refrain from making remarks. Please refrain from, making commentary on responses or things like that. This is a chance, for us to be able to hear directly from him, and we'd like to respect that opportunity. The other thing I want to say is, there's been a tremendous amount of testimony that's been provided in this nomination, in writing as well as in person. It is possible that the senators may want a chance to break, evaluate things overnight, and come back tomorrow afternoon. We have reserved the room for tomorrow afternoon in the event we do need to do that. But we will at least have our opening remarks and begin our questioning today. We then may take a short recess to discuss as senators whether we want to finish tonight and go into voting, or whether we need some additional time to evaluate. And then we would be coming back and letting you folks know. In the event it does go over till tomorrow, I think the room, we would be making the announcement as far as to when it would be, but it would be sometime tomorrow afternoon, because I do believe we have a session tomorrow morning. So, anything else I forgot? No? Okay. So with that, Mr. Ching, I'd like to invite you to make your opening remarks. Yeah.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my family, my wife, here, Cindy, my daughter, Malia, her husband, Ose, is in the back, her two older children, Mackenzie and Morgan, and my son, Casey, who just left work and forgot his shoes, apparently. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience today. Senator Chairperson Thielen, Vice Chair Gubernatorial, and members of the Senate and Waterline Committee, also Senate President Kim and Governor Ige, and also the staff of DLNR. Thank you for providing me this chance to provide my comments. I'd first like to thank everyone who appeared today to share their opinion, their testimony, to take their time to come up and share their constructive criticism. I think that's helpful. It's a learned process to hear varying viewpoints. I provided you my responses earlier and my testimony for your information. Serving the people of the state of Hawaii and fulfilling the mission and duties of DLNR are responsibilities that I hold in high regard. I'm humbled and honored to be nominated by Governor Ige to ask to serve and to carry out these responsibilities. On January 19th of this year, I discussed in earnest with the Governor Ige the position of the chairperson of the Board on Land and Natural Resources. There was no specific agenda or directive. His request was very simple and forthright. Come over and help us. Bring your work experience. Come and serve the state of Hawaii in this capacity. And to continue the work of DLNR. As you've heard, the DLNR has a tremendous responsibility to enhance, protect, conserve, and manage Hawaii's unique and limited and natural resources. And you've also heard the challenges they have with budgeting and resources. The DLNR has oversight and broad responsibility to managing and administering and exercising control over all of these resources. The Commission on Water Resource Management is attached to the DLNR and administers the state water code with its mission to protect and enhance the water resources of the state. Ahu Moku Advisory Council is part of the process that also advises the DLNR and chair. And attached to DLNR are 3 federal programs: the Kaho'olawe Island Reserve, the Papa Hanau Mokuakea Monument, and the Humpback Whale Sanctuary. An enormous task in an enormous department to administer The chair must work closely with the DLNR and the Water Commission and the administrators of 10 different divisions and many other managers to effectively manage DLNR, while always being mindful of 3 overarching policies: the Hawaii Public Trust Doctrine, 2050 Sustainable Plan, and of course DLNR's statute and mission statement. The mission statement has to be our guide. It is their guide. Managing these policies and mandates require a close working relationship with both the DLNR and the Water Commission. Compliance to law and mandates and policies. Outreach and collaboration with stakeholders. Keen sensitivity to our host culture. And the reliance of the expertise of the DLNR staff. It's a process. It has to be a transparent process to seek balance and solution, what I call the sweet spot, in the best interest of the state of Hawaii. The chairperson must manage this process to assure the mandates and missions of the DLNR are carried out in a balanced and measurable manner. He needs a thorough understanding of both sides of an issue, sensitivity to and appreciation of differing viewpoints, the inherent conflict that can exist between enhancing, protecting, conserving, and managing our precious and limited resource, the ability to fairly apportion and allocate limited resources, and have an expansive network of meaningful relationships in both the public and private sectors. My previous employment, which has seemed to be the criticism, has provided me a wide range of viewpoints, of skill sets, of public policy issues, as well as community engagement, related political and legislative processes to seek sustainable and reasonable solutions. Waihole Valley gave me an opportunity to work with people of many backgrounds with the state of Hawaii. It provided me valuable insights for balancing economic viability and impacts, varying and conflicting viewpoints and interests, budget, planning, design disciplines to implement a policy and program to preserve Waihole Valley for future generations. And just for clarification per a comment that I heard earlier, I was not at HHA during the civil strife. In the 1978, I believe, they blocked the road. Governor made a decision to purchase Waihole Valley using HHA funds. By the time I got there in 1980, the controversy was still brewing because the community felt that we just turned the controversy to a housing agency who would develop. And therein began my work in Waihole Valley in 1980. My employment with major landowners have given me a unique opportunity and experience in a wide variety of asset management and land stewardship and management programs in varying degrees and scopes. It affirmed the need and importance of responsible and diversified land stewardship and sustainability. There were diverse opinions, opposition, adversity on many issues. Listening to opposing viewpoints and seeking balance to discussions based on community input taught me how to focus towards ultimately finding a responsible and reasonable solution. We had to collaborate with many people from different backgrounds in connection with my community outreach efforts. I have been part of a management team with oversights on many programs involving conservation, development of renewable energy facilities, agriculture use, designation of important ag lands, and of course, residential development. Collaboration is essential. Working with groups of different viewpoints and the importance of finding opportunities for partnering and achieving common goals and win-win sustainable solutions, listening and understanding positions and convictions to respect and appreciate different viewpoints, and the importance of consensus, community building, partnerships, and balancing competing interests. It can be attained with meaningful collaboration with stakeholders who are sincere in seeking a resolution. My volunteer work on various nonprofit boards for a variety of organizations dealing with important social issues provided insights into broad board protocol and governance, setting goals and policies, strategic business plans, measured metrics and accountability, and a reliance on a dedicated workforce. I believe this background can be of benefit to DLNR. But there must be a reliance on the professional and dedicated team at DLNR. I've met with a variety of individuals and groups since my nomination. I counted 20 or so. And in many of those situations, it was early on in the game, and I had not even had the opportunity to meet with the DLNR staff. So in many of those early meetings, there were some angst about what I knew about DLNR, and I fully understand that. Subsequently, as Cardi and his team has provided me opportunities to meet with them, you gather or grasp a better understanding of just what DLNR is. In the course of trying to understand the functions of DLNR and those of the board or the chair, I've been asked several times to comment on particular objectives and initiatives that I would like to see effectuated when I get there. It was very premature, I felt, to say anything in that regard or to make any bold pronouncements without working closely with DLNR team, without understanding their goals and objectives, and without input from various stakeholders. However, I am mindful of Governor Ige's desire to protect and preserve our fragile natural environment, to seek a healthy environment, responsible economic growth through comprehensive planning that engages many stakeholders, to prioritize programs to make prudent expenditures of limited funds, to explore new revenue sources, to balance the interests of multiple interests, and to do what is best for the state. What's the best interest of our state? These guidelines will be considered in analyzing DLNR issues. My heart, my core, and my foundation comes from my beginning, my humble beginning. My parents, my ohana, teachers, coaches, teammates who have played with and opposed, and mentors all influenced and guided me. My core beliefs shape who I am today and provide me my foundation that has stayed with me regardless of who I have worked for. I was raised in Kapahulu by middle-class, hardworking parents who both worked at Pearl Harbor. Their purpose was to provide a better foundation for us. Born and raised in these islands and being part Hawaiian, I have an innate and deep respect for this land and its natural resource. To honor and respect our host culture, to learn from our past, to help define our future in the best interests of all who cherish this place we call home, to protect our home. And our resources. We are individually inspired by many factors and experiences in our lives. My simple inspiration came as I attended a recent grade school basketball game to cheer on my oldest granddaughter, who was not injured at the time, Kenzie. To watch her play, to watch all the young athletes play their heart out, to watch the families support them, to watch that foundation on that court at Palama Settlement. One side basketball, the other side was volleyball. To watch them go up and down that court and say, this is our foundation, this is what we teach, education, play hard, practice hard, learn every day, do something. It affects your destiny. Same thing my parents taught me. There was a reminiscent scene that many of us have witnessed before. To learn from winning, to learn from losing, foundation for their success, to set a course of action for their destiny. It was at that precise moment that I was moved to commit to serve and subsequently accepted governor's nomination for this position. It reminded me that the foundation we set today, the decisions we make today, will determine our future and our destiny for Hawaii. And the legacy we leave for our children and our grandchildren and the generations to follow. Ultimately, the future of Hawaii, our home. This is why I'm here today. They've asked me what my initial objectives are at DLNR. I will comply with the law. I will be guided by DLNR's mission. I will engage public and private stakeholders to seek a balance, to find that sweet spot, that resolution we need, to do what is right to enhance, protect, conserve, and manage Hawaii's precious resource in the best interest of the state of Hawaii. Not a landowner, not a special interest. The state of Hawaii is all of us. To honor and respect our host culture, to protect this home, the very essence of who we are. I respectfully request your support, confirmation to allow me the privilege to do this and serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ching. Senators, I'm going to call on you folks for questions. Again, for those of you who have not been here before, and then also especially for the family. Part of the Senate's job in advice and consent is to ask questions of the nominees. I know it's difficult for you folks to sit there. My daughter was 14 when I went through it, and she sat and listened to it as well. But as somebody said before, this is democracy in action, and we would be very derelict in our duty if we didn't ask questions. And there were a lot of information that you see in front of us and that was testifying today, so I expect that the senators are going to have a lot of questions. Each senator is not going to ask all their questions. We may go a number of rounds, but at this point, senators, any committee members want to begin? Senator Sloan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Ching. A couple initial questions. First of all, how difficult was it for you to give up a lucrative career and higher salary to take on this position, and this position, for example, rather than head of Department of Business?
Very challenging. Sacrifice that I was willing to make to serve. And when you make these sacrifices, sometimes it's more than just monetary. And my inspiration, again, was simple. It's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for them. For all of us. So, when the position was first offered to me, I don't know if you know, I declined. I contemplated, I couldn't understand the commitment, the time, wasn't willing to make that. It changed after I was inspired and after I spoke with the governor. So it was a very challenging decision to make.
You've heard others today define your position in terms of historic preservation. Why don't you define your position?
It's our culture. It's precious. We have to do everything we can to protect our historic and cultural assets here. So the discussion with the BIA and the position on the Shipty rule, I think it's mischaracterized. They are not opposed to abolishing the law. They were looking at the 50-year rule, is what I understand. And the 50-year rule is any structure that's 50 years or older automatically has to have a review. And when you drill it down, that meant a contractor who was helping a family in Waipahu put on a new roof, as an example, had to be submitted and subjected to that process. And so that's what the issue was there, I understand. And of course, you saw their logo. So as Ms. Monroe explained, it was to bring awareness to that issue. Because if you're an owner of a 50-year-old structure, you may not know how that affects you until you got a leaky roof and has to go fix it. So it never was about imploding that law. It was simply to look at the facilitating of repairs and of structures that are 50 years old. Never intending to remove the historical and cultural content of that law is what I understand. I think you ought to protect that wherever we can.
And finally, for now, have you had any time or any thoughts in terms of preparing a plan for action?
I've only had one opportunity, two opportunities. One was a staff meeting that the party set up, and the second one were individual meetings with administrators and the federal manager programs. Have not had a time to look at it. I know there is a report that they prepared for the legislature, and it lists all their goals and objectives. So that's a start point. I'd like to see how they're moving forward with that. What's the measurable? How are you getting at your issues? What's your challenges to get there? And let's have a measurable deliverable somewhere in the process so you can see it.
Thank you, Mr. Ching. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Ihara?
I wanted to ask you how you would characterize the criticism of you, or actually opposition for you being confirmed, based on your membership in LERF as well as BIA, as well as working for Carleton Cook. And to what extent are there those concerns valid?
Well, first of all, my background in developing homes, I think is a good thing. Providing shelter for Hawaii's families is a sustainable thing. We build neighborhoods, we build communities, we allow families to build their equity. Many of the middle class families, that is their sole source of value. So building homes, I think, is a good thing. I think the criticism there is the challenge of our choice of using that particular piece of land for that use. Carleton Cook is a diversified landowner. They have lands in ag, renewable energy, conservation, but residential is a core for them. So that's why they choose to do development. And development is a sustainable thing because it builds communities.
I'm trying to understand if you can appreciate the fears that people may have given your background.
So in the course of development, I've never been in any company that sits back and says, how do we get around statutes and laws? It's, here they are. There's some certainty, there's some predictability to it. Let's go through the process. And that's what Carleton Cook has done with the entitlement process. When I state that you have to comply with the law, that's what you're required to do. It's never an attempt to skirt that law. So on environmental law, are there mitigative measures to look at when you take land out of ag? Sure there are, and we try to mitigate that. My affiliation with nonprofit boards have been varied. LERF has been one, BIA, higher education, HBU, Polimomi Hospital, medical, and Pacific Housing Assistance, which is a nonprofit low-income rental developer. So it's been varied. LERF, as you've seen, takes on many issues, but their mission statement has been a little misinterpreted this morning, and I think I clarified that for you.
Try one more time. Do you understand about the idea of culture, the culture of people in the development community, landowners? There's a certain corporate culture mindset,
right.
And then there's also a different, I think a very different culture of those who are concerned about preserving our natural and cultural resources. So they're like really different cultures. They're like different countries, different cultures. And I think what if I hear your opponents right, is they're concerned that you're from have been living in a development culture, and then you are now going to embed yourself in a DLNR or protection of resources culture. And can you make that transition? Can can you live in the new culture and actually kind of be faithful to it in a way?
Yes, I can. The mission statement is clear. Especially if it's state land held in trust for all of us, it's clear what we have to do. If it's private land and a private landowner has an agenda to use it for some other reason, then they have to comply with the law. If there's cultural sites, if there's EV, that developer has to comply with that law. Now, it may not be to the extent that people want, but that's the private landowner. For public lands, by all means, we should do everything we can to protect and conserve it.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Carleton. I want to follow up on Senator Ihara's statements about culture. Because here in Hawaii, we have the conservation culture per se, and we have a Native Hawaiian conservation culture per se. So the Native Hawaiian culture, you don't fence things off. You work with the land. The ahupua'a system, right? You gather as much as you need, then you save it for another day. In the area of conservation in terms of the Western culture, and by the way, they're going to be coming to Hawaii. There's going to be a big conservation conference. And that particular science doesn't square with the Native Hawaiian science. So it's going to be an interesting conversation in and of itself. But how do you square the Native Hawaiian culture? Because one of the previous speakers was talking about gathering rights. I don't think the conservation people are talking about gathering rights. They may be talking about just closing it off. There has to be a balance there, so as not to put everything into one basket, because it's different. So how do you square the Native Hawaiian culture, gathering rights, and the conservation?
I think you hit it on the head. You got to find that balance between the two opposing issues, if you can.
I don't know whether they're opposing issues, but
okay.
We've got to find a way to work it together.
That's right. So collaboration is key. Getting people in the same room to present their viewpoints, to try to resolve that issue, because there are two sides. I mean, herein lies the conflict with the mission statement, right? How do you enhance and preserve and manage, and protect? So in that example, you would have to call upon the expertise of the staff to see what the science is in that particular watershed or forest reserve, to see what's going on, who's doing the gathering in that area, get them in the same room if we can, come up with a reasonable solution.
Squirrely, do you plan on dismantling any of the protections that have been fought for so long?
That is never my intent, but I haven't reviewed them all yet. I'm not
well,
sure.
You've been characterized as somebody who's going to dismantle the protections.
Well, no, why would we do that? I mean, if the protections are in place, in spite of what people have characterized LERF doing, it's always about honoring our culture and our history. It's not about dismantling that. Private owners have a different perspective, perhaps, but on public land, we have to protect our historic and cultural assets.
Okay. I'll yield for now. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Rudman.
Hi. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about management experience. Part of the discussion today has been whether, absent a history of involvement in conservation and preservation, but you have apparently a strong interest in administration and management. So part of the discussion is that that's what's needed and that's sufficient. So let me ask you a little bit about how many employees, or can you tell me about some times when you've directly managed some employees? How many of them, what were your duties?
I think my largest responsibility was when I was at Molokai Ranch. It was more on the operations side. I was flying in daily, Monday to Friday, sometimes on the weekend, to manage an operation crew. But even then, I didn't manage the rank and file. I managed department heads. automotive shop, site construction, landscaping, rangers, recreation groups. I did the HR for a little while, and I was a safety coordinator for the company for a little while. So direct reports, people who directly reported to me, maybe 7 or 8. Under them, each division, upwards of 50 plus people. When Molokai Ranch, when I was there, we employed about 100 and just over 130 or so people. So I mentioned in my comments, indirectly, we managed them all because we were part of the HR, we were part of the safety group. You manage the entire operation crew to maintain the assets of Molokai Ranch.
Okay, thank you. Did you do hiring, evaluations, firing, pay rate setting?
We did.
Do that kind of stuff?
Yes, we did.
Did you set policy for that organization?
Molokai Ranch, when we got there, I want to characterize it by saying they had no SOP manual. We set that manual as we came across policy.
Okay.
So it was that type of operation. Primarily a farming ag operation. So we set policy as we went, and I was in charge of the policy manual, and it was on my desk. And when I left employment there, the folder was about that big. And it was called C's policy for some reason, but it was the policy of the state, of Molokai Ranch. So we did set policy.
Okay. All right, thank you. In some of your discussions over the last couple of weeks or a couple of months, you've talked about looking at the P&L, the profit loss picture of the department. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I've come to realize that government doesn't work in P&Ls. In fact, when I met with the ASO, she said, here's our budget, and this is how we operate. Here's our costs. So my lens was to look at, in any operation, show me your expenses, show me your revenue stream, show me the difference, show me the programs that you're intending to meet or doing by this. To me, that's the first step in looking at any organization. And then you can see how you might improve it, how and if we can move funds around to make it better. I understand that that's not real flexible at DLNR. You can't just switch funds around to offset another division if they're lacking funds or resources. So that was what I meant, typical P&L.
Okay, thank you. When you look at different departments in DLNR or in any organization, you kind of have to put a valuation on them somehow, I think. There's parts of DLNR that are difficult to value in dollars and cents. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Are you speaking of economic value or value to the state? If it's purely economic value, I'm assuming you can get a very smart financial guy to give you some valuation per department, per asset they own, per equipment they have, per contracts in place, asset value. Cultural value, I don't think you can define that. It's huge. The responsibility they have to manage all the state's resources is invaluable because it's not just a number, it's our brand. It's what people come for. So imagine if you said, we don't have this brand anymore in Hawaii. Tourists, we don't have this Diamond Head to come to. We don't have the beach. That brand is invaluable. So I don't know how you put a value on that other than it's who we are.
So sometimes in this job, you're going to have to evaluate putting financial resources into situations that don't give any financial return. So can you talk about how will you weigh that value with something like a natural area reserve? How will you weigh justifying expenses spent on something that's never going to give you $1 return? And how can you explain to me what you see as the value of a natural area reserve?
I think we have to put resources to manage and protect our natural resources. I don't know, I haven't seen the metrics yet for doing that. I don't know what it takes as far as manpower and equipment and costs, but it's certainly something we got to put effort to. So if the metric says that we're only doing it 60% of the time, as an example, then the evaluation would be, so where's the other 40% coming from? Because it's not generating revenue. And it is a service, a responsibility that we have to address. So how do we get that? It's easy to say, give us more of the state budget. But how do we get there? How do we figure out that, how do you miss that? How do you catch up on that 40%? And if it's important resources, you can't not maintain and put efforts to it. And at the end of the day, in any business, when you do that, you have what we call, in general terms, deferred maintenance. You're just letting the roof get worse and worse until the rain comes crashing through. Then you are forced to throw your assets at it. So if you keep deferring these things, then you keep deferring the program. You have to allocate funds and resources to it somehow. And if that means shifting programs around to do that, I'd sure like to figure out if we can.
Okay, so thank you. That's a good answer. Today we've heard a phrase that I've heard many times, that Hawaii is the endangered species capital of the world. How do we evaluate how much resources should be devoted to protecting endangered species? How do we balance that against competing concerns that are going to bring in revenue, let's say, or are going to be much more seen and used by the public, versus what do we do about endangered species going extinct?
Well, that's a good question. I would guess that the approach would be to find that sweet spot. How do we get there with limited resources? If it's an important endangered species, and they all are, how do you do that? So does that mean curtailing efforts and shifting budgets from one division to the other? And are divisions willing to do that? Can divisions come over and help us with invasive species on the other side? That's the things that I like to go find out with the different departments. You have 10 different divisions, all dedicated men and women. They all have their budgets, they all have their constraints, and I have seen them working together in concert. So when they can, I think they should help out each other to address those issues.
Okay, and one last question for now, and I'll let others take their turn. And I realize this isn't your area of expertise. I'm not trying to catch you in something you don't know, but it's of great concern to me. How do you think, what's the bottom line? How do we protect an endangered species from going extinct?
Well, I think you got to have some science and baselines to understand the specific species and what caused it to be, or what can cause it to be extinct, and the measures you have to take to save it. That's the approach, I guess. And then when you find out the result or the method, then commit the funds and resources to do that.
Do you think it's important to prevent extinctions?
Oh, by all means, yes.
Why? Can you tell me why you feel that's important?
Because we have limited resources. Some of these endangered species are one of a kind. Once they leave our premises, they leave it forever. We should try our best to preserve and catalog which ones are of main importance, which ones are invasive that no need to protect and should be eliminated, and catalog them. I'm assuming that is being done now, and to figure out which ones are the priorities to save. They have to be saved.
Okay, I'll leave that for now. Thank you very much, Mr. Ching, and I'll get back to other questions after a bit. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Senator Rivera.
Aloha. Wanted to follow up on a comment you made a moment ago, that the difference between public ownership of land and private ownership. It seems that you see there's a very big distinction between the two. And I was wondering if you could clarify how do you describe the difference and the value of those two different ownerships?
Sure. Having worked for some private landowners in the past, they all have their distinct strategies for the use of their land. Public lands, in this case, are clear to me. I mean, every department has public land, and their uses are defined by their mission, DOE, DOT, public land. In the case of the lands we manage, it's distinctively by our mission statement, is to preserve and enhance those limited resources. So in that lens, it's state land, it's our house, we need to protect and preserve and manage as best we can. A private landowner does the same in a different scale. Of course, they get criticized for using their lands in different scales, but the private landowner will do the same thing. And they're required to comply with all laws. So I know in past history, even with the state, when we found EV on state projects, when we found cultural sites, we complied with the law. We preserved them. We took the necessary action to save them. Many landowners and developers do that today.
Do you sense that private ownership always relates to, or maybe this brings into another question, the highest and best use? We've heard there were some people that testified in support of you in those written stacks of things, and they said, well, you understand the value of highest and best use. How would you apply that to the difference between public lands and private lands?
It's a different definition, I think, for public, because I think for private, it means an economic use, the best economic use you can get out of your land asset. Many times, private landowners are driven by that. In the case of the state or public lands, highest best use is not necessarily a economic margin. It could be a social margin, it could be a conservation margin, preservation. It's a different lens, it's a different margin altogether.
So if I was a legacy landowner who owned vast tracts of land, agricultural lands, conservation lands, little of this, little of that, are you saying there's a different standard then for just because it's not owned by the state?
I think those examples, if that landowner has committed to an easement, then they've decided what the highest and best use is.
Do you believe that if somebody owns a piece of land that they're entitled to just about whatever they want with it?
That's not what the law allows.
No. Okay.
So, I mean, therein lies the issue with our paradise, right? People around the world want to come here and live in our paradise. And yet many realtors, developers, don't realize how restrictive, on purpose, our land use laws are. We have one of the most restrictive land entitlement processes in place, and that is for a reason, because we have a limited resource. So if you're going to change something for the permanent, you better make real sure that it's being done in the right way. So our land use laws, our environmental laws, the county planning system, county rezoning system are all part of that process to making sure if you're going to change something for the permanent, you have been totally vetted in the process.
Do you think that if you have private land, let's say again you are fortunate enough that you own a fair bit of land, is it not your responsibility to recharge aquifers and manage the lands in that way? So in other words, is it just the public who has the responsibility to recharge watersheds and that, or if you have ag lands, you should be able to do whatever you want with it? I just wanted to get to clarification on that.
Again, if it's private land, it's really up to the landowner. and the context of which he owns that land. So you have a wide variety of purpose by landowners. Some can be speculators, some can be not wanting to do anything on land stewardship. I'm not sure how you motivate them to do that, but for public lands, I think we should be doing all of that, where we can preserve watersheds or aquifers.
I guess I'm just circling back to the highest and best use, and my heart tells me that highest and best use is not always the economic driver, and I'm not sure if maybe we disagree on that, including private lands. I don't think that just because you own a piece of land, in my position, my thought, you just can't do whatever you want, whatever's allowed. Sometimes there's a higher and greater purpose.
Okay, so that's the definition, higher and greater purpose. Highest and best use is an economic term that generally is applied to value. What's the highest value? Highest and best purpose, it's per individual, per philosophy, per your own perspective.
Per community?
Could be per community as well, sure.
So if a community feels very strongly about which way some development issues are going, there may be some consideration there that trumps the private property ownership, or how do we balance that?
I think it's part of the land use process that everyone goes through now. So that is always vetted in that entire process. I think you're seeing that now in the Malai Kahana issue, where the community is jousting over what's right. In that case, the county development plan has said no urban growth boundary. So how do you address that? It's being vetted now publicly.
Okay. And Chair, if I may go one more little question. So getting on now to important ag lands, I think that's of everyone's concern too. This has been an enigma since the 70s, right? When it's like, well, we got to start saving some important ag lands. How do you do that without a takings? And landowners can voluntarily do so. We all know that, and you've alluded to that if that's their management interest. But do you have any advice or thoughts on how can we as a society, community, how are we going to get there? How are we actually going to lock up some important ag lands? What's it going to take to nudge that along? Or should the county just define what's important by its soil classification and mandate it?
That's an interesting policy discussion that has been ongoing since CONCON. Before Representative Ezra Kanoho left, he instituted that IAL law, which said you had to protect important ag lands. In the subsequent years, there were a provision for private owners to voluntarily designate your lands for important ag lands, and it had to meet certain criteria. Soils was one of the gauges. Castle and Cook was the first Waihole landowner to do that here. So we designated IAL lands. Other landowners have done that throughout the state. The state has substantial ag lands that I'm not sure what their status is. I know the county has a IAL task force looking at how they designate lands. In this case, though, the county doesn't have, in my understanding, ag expertise that the state has. So are you going to arbitrarily designate a swath of dirt because it's ag zone and say that's important ag land?
Right, and that's why I'm asking what your thoughts are, and not to belabor this too long, and I appreciate you going with me on this line of thinking, but what is the equitable way? And back to that higher and best use, that purpose of the land, important ag lands, watershed protection, things like that. How do we get there?
Well,
how are we going to get there?
In the case of IAL, I think then the issue is if the highest and best use for that parcel is ag, then do you have a business plan and the financing and the farmer to make that plan work? Because the designation of that land doesn't make the program work. It doesn't grow the crop. You still need all the programs that got to be put to it. The infrastructure, labor, water, subsidy, marketing. So just because it's IAL does not signify that crops are just popping out on their own. So, but that is the first step, designating which lands are important for ag. Private landowners are motivated by different things. When Castle Cook designated IL, they did not use the landowner incentive. And in fact, I know they just recently sold a portion of that IL land to a farmer in Central Waihole. So that's diversification of assets as well.
Okay, appreciate you. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair.
Senator Shimabukuro?
Hi, Mr. Ching. So what is the status of the Waihole taro, the taro fields there that Calvin Ho talked about? Is it under DLNR now?
When I was at HHA, we worked to develop a hybrid project, if you will, an ag park with residential lots. And while I was there, we worked with the community to develop a long-term lease arrangement. I was not there when they finally executed it some 20 years later, but that was the issue with the community. And what Mr. Ho described was my ability to, my participation with the community in figuring out the boundaries. And as he indicated, the McCandless estate owned it at one time and had permits to a bunch of ag and residential lessees. And these permits were one-page agreements that described their parcels in very general terms: landmark, mango tree, bend in the road, stream. And so one of the first things we did in figuring and gaining credibility with the community was meeting with them and telling them, okay, we're the state, we're the HHA, but we have to come in and help you subdivide this property because you need a legal description of your lot. And that is attached to eventually a lease. So we got to come in and develop. And so we explained what development was at that point. And so in the case of the Hoes, where you had these jigsaw pieces of puzzle in Waihole, and you had this expanse of land between them, the best thing to do was cut it in the middle and share it with two lessees that were there, because they were already there. So that's how that example
And now,
played out.
when that lease runs out, I mean, is it? I think I sense a bit of concern. You know, I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, is it going to go to like the highest bidder, or how is it possible for that taro farm to stay there?
Well, I guess it's an economic issue. I don't know who the lease is held with now. I believe it's still with HFDC. 55-year ag leases was intended to subsidize and promote farming and ag. So I would assume at the end of the 55-year lease, someone is going to sit back and analyze, was that program successful? Did we subsidize that lease and improvements in that Waihole Valley Ag Park for 55 years, and what was the cost benefit to the state? Did it equate to X amount of produce coming out of that property? So that's one measure. And then at 55 years, as Mr. Ho said, the land is still very valuable because it's limited asset. So who's the next bidder in line that will take it to the next level? And so, of course, there's angst and fear about how can I compete for that? Well, the question is, how long, or does the state want to continue subsidizing that lease?
But now, and you talked about balancing traditional and customary rights with, highest and best use and finding a sweet spot. When you do that analysis as DLNR chair, which takes priority? Is this public trust or private rights?
It's got to be public trust. Yeah, I mean, it's a public agency, so private rights, I would say, are on the outside of our public land trusts. I think that's priority for DLNR. Yeah.
Okay, so private commercial use that might compete for a taro patch like that, and so it would take a backseat to the traditional customary rights.
That's a hard question, and I can't speak for whatever state agency holds that lease again. But you can see that the economic discussion will play out.
Yeah.
In this case, the whole family may not want to pay 3 or 4 times the value of that lease, or 3 or 4 times the amount of the lease they've been paying now, because ABC company can come in and do something to maintain it and pay a higher rate and do farming. It may not be taro, it may be some other farming. So I guess that's the decision that's deferred to the holder of that lease.
But do state agencies like DLNR have an obligation to protect Native Hawaiian customary and traditional practices? I mean, does the agency also have to assess the impact that a development may have on those kind of practices?
I believe they do. In the land division, that's basically what they do. Besides looking at the value of a lease, I think that's part of their core, to look at how you balance that as best as you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. And there's been some court cases, Kukui, Waihole cases, that talked about, permitted uses. And if an agency fails to condition permitted uses on protecting Native Hawaiian traditional customary practices, can that be grounds to invalidate the granting of the permit?
Gee, it's unfair for me to comment. I don't know enough about that legal case or how the DLNR AGs would react to that. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
In those two cases, they did find that the permit was invalid because it didn't have sufficient consideration of how the allowance of the developer to use water would affect Hawaiian rights.
I see.
Do Native Hawaiians have access rights on government land?
I understand they do, yes. Yes.
But now, why did LURF criticize the PASH decision?
I'll have to defer to LURF. I'm not sure why. They represent private landowners. I don't recall Councilman Cook opposing that particular issue.
Yeah, it was in Kahea's testimony.
My only example that I can fish out of my mind is the George Harrison example. Several years ago, he had purchased a piece on Kauai, and he was opposed to the cultural walk-ins right through his property, but he wasn't opposed to allowing people to get to the site. It was walking right through my property. So I don't think any of us would be any different. You can come and gather on the shoreline, just don't walk through my house and my garage. Walk through the side of the property. I think, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I think that was the issue. Yeah.
And now, what's the connection between DLNR, traditional and customary rights, and the conservation district?
The conservation district, I'll have to defer. I'm not certain.
I mean, my understanding is that DLNR has jurisdiction over conservation district, both private and public
That's right.
lands within that district.
Right, the conservation district is under the jurisdiction of DLNR, right?
Yeah, and it's over 2 million acres, private and public land, and I guess I guess that's where a lot of these concerns, because that's where a lot of the traditional customary practices are, these far reaches of the shorelines,
Right.
up in the mountains, and places like that.
Right.
Another question that Kahea brought up is that LURF opposed, OHA every year has as part of their package, one of their bills is to offer free, they will pay the cost of training the boards and commissions of the state on traditional and customary Hawaiian rights. And the LURF opposed that legislation. Why is that?
I'll have to defer to LURF. I have no idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but now you were involved with LURF for quite some time?
Well, let me explain. We although I heard the comment that if you're part of the board, you are supposed to know everything that happens with that board. Well, it's macro governance at best. We meet maybe once a month. The LURF is comprised of different members. If you're a member, a landowner, you are automatically a standing VP. The VP group, the officers each year are elected every year from this VP group of, I think, 10, 12 maybe members, all landowners. HECO is involved. And you rely on the executive director to drive the issues. So there are many times when we are not fully aware of it until we see the testimony. Or we assemble as a group for an issue and we go, well, how did you take that position and why? And no hands on it. We didn't want any part of it. But that's how LERF operates. It's not a very formal process where we sit and say, let's go attack, support, oppose these particular issues. Yeah. So I'd have to defer. I'm sure there's a reason for them taking that position. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Ihara?
I had a kind of quick follow-up question to your response to Senator Revere's question. Let's say there's, and it's a difference between publicly owned lands and privately owned lands. And let's say DLNR has jurisdiction over conservation lands, and there's a conservation district use permit, and there's a plan to put in some, urban use to it. How would you treat them both? The plan, whether it's on private property or public property, would you or the department treat them the same?
I think any use on conservation, it gets very sensitive, public or private. I would have to defer on the expertise of Sam Lemo in that area to make sure that we're complying with the law. Conservation lands are, again, very sensitive. So if it involves watersheds, forest reserves, stream protection, I would think you want to be very delicate about putting any structure in there. Now, I know that the conservation district allows one structure per lot. And that's a discussion with many people. Well, I bought this conservation parcel and I'm allowed to put one structure. So that's some of the challenges that Mr. Lemo has, I know. And looking at, on a case by case, what's permissible, what's the best thing to do on conservation.
So would a property owner's property rights be a factor in deciding whether the conservation land gets used for a particular purpose?
I think the guideline is a law. I believe the statute allows one structure per conservation. So I guess in that discussion, if the law is not meeting its intended purpose to conserve private or public land, then we go and change the law. But I believe the conservation district allows one structure. And I say structure because developers, people who sell these properties always embellish what a structure can be, unfortunately. And therein lies some of the challenges in the industry. You're selling this piece of dirt to an investor from New Jersey, and it is pristine land, but they forget it's conservation, and they come to town and they go, I'm going to build my trophy home. Oh, maybe not, Mr. New Jersey, because it's conservation. So the law allows one structure per...
Without a permit?
No, you have to get a CDO.
Okay, so that's with a permit.
Yeah, you have to go to the... And the process is quite intense from what I understand. And it is like any land use process with condition and mitigation and environmental review if it's required. So it's an extensive process. It's not just like getting a permit and pulling it and building a home. While on that matter, if I may, the other comment I heard, and I was quoted in different news reports, that in 205 I made a flippant comment about just give us a stamp and we'll go. And that context was in light of I forget if it was a housing or a Senate Affordable Housing Forum in 205. And they invited EARTH, developers, industry to come and discuss how challenging it was to process development. In 2005, housing crisis at that time. We're 10 years out now. In 2005, I was working for Castle & Cook, and we had just gotten our second LUC, I believe. Excuse me, no, we were waiting to go get our second LUC. And so we described the process of land use entitlement in the state of Hawaii. And we said it was predictable, we understood it, we will go through it. And the question, I forget who asked, was, well, what would you do, Carleton, if you just wanted to build homes today? In that context, I said, just give us a stamp, we'll go. That's how I used that. It never was intended to bypass the existing laws. That was in 2005. Co-Ridge in 2015 is still awaiting to be built. So you talk about the housing crisis on that issue, it's still there. Process takes a long time.
I'm going to call on Senate President now.
Thank you. Make sure everybody on the committee asks their questions. Good afternoon, or good evening, Carleton. I have a few questions that I would like to ask. Have you always agreed with whoever you worked for, the developer, Castle and Cook, with all of their development decisions in your tenure?
No. No. The beauty of working up the ladder and working in management is discussion. And there is a lot of disagreement in those management meetings on how we approach issues. Of course, the drive is always to produce profit margin, but there's substantial agreement that is internal for us that we have to work through to find our sweet spot in that discussion. So do
you feel in some of these issues that you may not have been in agreement and may have sided with the community, but at the end of the day, like all of us, whoever we work for or whatever our position, we disagree behind closed doors, but have to come to some kind of agreement in the public or to do your job? I'm not sure if you've met with conflict within yourself and having to do the job that you've done for the developer?
Well, I think somebody characterized me as a bulldog. So in those discussions where you have opposite opinions with your colleagues, it's can you convince them? So in my role, it wasn't housing production anymore. It's community relations. And so some in our team said, oh, our land is already entitled. We just go pull permit and go. I said, whoa, wait a minute. This parcel has been sitting for years. You got communities around him. Let's go do a outreach with the neighborhood board and let's go do these things. So we had many discussions and it always was, then you go do it, Carleton. I said, okay, I will. So that's what we did in Waipahu, in Renaissance. We did that in Makakilo. And unfortunately, in the neighborhood board system here, some people think, oh, I got an approval process. I said, no, we're just here to give you an FYI. So we did that many times, much to the disagreement internally. It's about transparency. We're going to come into your neighborhood. We're going to bring you new neighbors. We're going to bring you new traffic. The best we can do is tell you we're coming and explain to you what we're doing.
So can you change hats? Can you change your passion, having had a hat on the developer side, and which is what the concern of a number of the people who have testified in opposition, that it's ingrained in you, that it's your culture, and that we're putting the fox in the hen house to that extent. Can you truly change that and be able to do the job that, to protect our Aina, to do all these things?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
And do you want to spend the next 4 years, if that's how long it takes, under the microscope, being criticized because people will watch your every move, every decision that you make, as suspect? So you're going to be, and your family is going to be put through that. Is that something you've thought about? And
Sure.
you obviously agreed to this contentious kind of confirmation, and if you do, why?
Well, I think constructive criticism is good. It helps you see perspective. It helps you move on. Unwarranted criticism is unfortunate, and how you overcome that is by showing them what you can do. We understand, my family understands the sacrifices that we're making. Can I change? Yes. I'm not the fox guarding the hen house. I'm the bulldog guarding the house. So I will change that paradigm as soon as I change shirt.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard for people to imagine that. But when you change employer, you change mission. So Ask the guy who's working at McDonald's who's going to go take a quarter more in pay to work for Burger King. You change mission. You might be selling the same product. You change mission. You change alliance, and you change loyalty. And this is a huge responsibility.
I think we all understand that. We change hats and committee chairs all the time, depending on organization. And I know when I went over to the city council, I became the zoning chair. I was the zoning chair for 14 years. I had no land use experience. Talk about not knowing anything. And and I was pegged at being, really pro-development. And I think people were surprised after a while of my positions, and worked very closely with the League of Women Voters and so forth. But we do that. We do change. And when I took over a WAM committee, I'm not really good, never wanted to really do numbers and budgets, but we've done that. But we're in a different kind of role than you are. Obviously, let me just ask you this. What is your personal position on prime ag lands, on important ag lands? How do you feel about that? Personally, not, if you had your druthers.
I think we should save them if we can. But again, saving land for the sake of just saving it is just part and parcel of the food sustainability issue. If you're going to save a piece of dirt, then at least have a program, financing method to go and use that to grow the greens, the crop. Saving prime land for open space and anti-development, just call it open space. You want to save it for open space. But if it's saving it for pure ag purpose, then put the programs to it to make it work.
What about your position on, and I know this is not probably DLNR, but development and high rises on the Mackay side of the highway, along our beaches, along our ocean front? What's your position on that?
Is this in reference to the OHA program?
Well, it is, but overall, it's not necessarily just that. But how do we protect our beaches? How do we protect the erosion of our beaches and our?
Well, that's a sensitive topic, but we need housing choices. I mean, I'm wearing my housing hat now, and so I would advocate for a wide range of choices where appropriate. If it's not appropriate being on the shoreline, then don't put them there. You have something else. If it's not appropriate along every rail station, then don't put them there. But we got to have choices. The same choices we had when we were growing up. Hawaii Kai, Aina Haina, Kalihi, Kaneohe, Kapahulu, they were all choices we had. So I think the housing dynamic is you just have to have choices. Now, they got to be appropriate choices as well.
Okay, so are you for development on whether the choices or not personally? Would you want to see those buildings built on our ocean front?
For me, I'd rather see my ocean front. I hope I'm not speaking about or opposing any particular agency.
No, it's just your own personal. I mean, I have personal things, and I have to vote certain ways, and
right.
Sometimes we have to put our personal. I just want to know. I have one last question, Madam Chair, if I may. You were asked about what we can do to protect our important ag lands, and these decisions. Is it your decision, though? Is it the decision of the chairperson of the Land and Natural Resources on what lands we protect? And how we go about protecting them?
For IAL, you mean?
IAL or any kind of that. Is that the chairperson's?
Well, I would assume that if the Department of Land has ag land, then we ought to be looking at seeing which land should be protected for IAL. I think Department
Right.
of Ag has ag land, and I think.
But do you make that final decision? Is it your decision on how we protect them?
Frankly, I would have to defer to the land division how they would approach protecting IAL land. And I'm not sure how much ag land they actually have.
Okay, I guess I was referring more to people saying that you kept saying you're follow the law, and that actually these policy decisions are made by the lawmakers. Right? I mean, we decide you can put one structure on the house. We decide, we passed out important ag land law, but we didn't put enough teeth in it, so it's dragged on. But it's our decisions, and some of our decisions have been poor. I admit that. When I was on the council, I told Castleton Cook, no more zoning after Malka. Okay, that's it, done. But when I left the council, they came back in, and the new council said, okay, you can build some more. Okay, you can build more. So it's us. It's the legislators, the people who's elected, who actually have that decision. If we want to protect the Mackay side, if we want to protect the ILA, then we better put in stronger laws so that you guys can follow the laws.
That's correct.
Right? I think that's our responsibility. And so I just want to make that comment that, it is our responsibility. And if it's not working, then we better do something about it. Then you got to then follow up as to what we pass. Right? Thank you.
Understand. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ching, I had a couple questions, and then we're going to go back around. Some of the testimony stated that at the early meetings that you had after your nomination was made, I think over on Maui, maybe some other places, where you were asked some questions about the public trust doctrine, and you said that you were not familiar with the public trust doctrine and weren't aware of it. Is that accurate?
At that time, I believe that was on a Saturday in January, a week after I accepted the nomination. I was scrambling to understand DLNR and looking at the website. That's the statement I made at that time. Since that time, I've been educated about what the public trust doctrine is, so it's within my. So unfortunately, when I met that group, it was to go on outreach.
No, I understand. So just up until January of 2015, you were not aware of the public trust doctrine?
I was aware of it generally, but not in the detail they wanted me to respond to.
Okay. What was your general understanding of it at the time?
It's an important doctrine to protect, preserve our precious resources, generally speaking. Yeah.
Now, earlier you were talking about Land Use Research Foundation. How long have you been on the board of directors of the Land Use Research Foundation?
I'll have to refer to my questions, my answers I provided for you. Because it's membership-based, every company has a seat on the board. Mm-hmm. So Carleton Coke is no different. We have a seat on the board. And let's see, my membership on the board as a representative of Carleton Coke started in 2006.
2006. And then how long have you served uninterrupted on that board of directors?
Since 2006. I resigned just recently at the end of January.
Okay,
Yeah.
So from 2006 to the beginning of 2015?
That's right.
And during that time, what was your position on the board of directors?
It very, as I said, there are standing VPs. Mm-hmm. So Carleton Coke's rep was a standing VP, okay, along with other membership reps. And as part of that standing VP, that's the group that officers were elected each year: president, treasurer, secretary. So in the year of fiscal year 2008, I was elected president.
Okay.
Yeah.
So during that 9-year period, you were either a vice president or a president of Land Use Research Foundation. Okay. You mentioned earlier, I think, that LERF's mission had been mischaracterized, but my understanding from looking at the LERF website is that it is an advocacy group that advocates for the rights of landowners and developers, the private property rights. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And I think one of the testifiers actually pulled out something on LERF about one of the primary benefits of LERF membership is our legislative initiatives, which serve to protect our members' business interests. And the one constant goal remains minimizing the impact of government intervention on the development process.
I'm not sure that's their mission. I mean, if you pick that up over their website, I would characterize that as part of their marketing promotion.
I think it was listed under one of their accomplishments.
Okay, well, their mission that was given to me is what I provided you in the March 6th response, which
but
was...
it is an advocacy group on behalf of landowners and developers.
But it clearly says for reasonable, rational, equitable land use planning, legislation, regulations that encourage well-planned economic growth and development.
Okay, so I think
and while safeguarding Hawaii's significant natural and cultural resources and public, so that's their mission. Now, these other things I think are being characterized by maybe the reports they put out. I'm not sure.
Well, it's being characterized as a list of accomplishments that it's providing to members about what the organization has been able to achieve. And it says that one of our primary membership benefits is the efforts to minimize government intervention on the development process, and that membership is for landowners and developers. So I understand the mission statement, but it is an advocacy group on behalf of landowners and developers,
Sure.
correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So during that time of your tenure on the Land Use Research Foundation, you had mentioned something about how you'd never been a part of a company that says, let's find a ways to get around the law. But LRF advocated to keep the Public Land Development Corporation, and that advocacy took place over a significant amount of time. So can you tell me why you supported keeping the Public Land Development Corporation?
Me personally, I did not support the PLDC. I think LRF took the position, and I'll have to defer to LRF.
I'm sorry, but when you say you have to defer to LRF, the executive director of LRF under the bylaws is hired by the board of directors, correct? And is an employee of the board of directors?
That's correct.
Okay.
But I can't tell you what he said in testimony. I hadn't seen it.
Well,
to be quite honest with you.
regardless of whether you saw the specific testimony or not, the executive director acts at the direction of the board of directors as the employee. That's why they call you directors, right?
He has the latitude to make many decisions on his own as the executive director.
So over this period that the public was having the debate about the Public Land Development Corporation, that took place over the course of about a year when the organization was going out and doing draft rulemaking, and then was swept up through the legislative session. So over this 11-month period of high public attention on the Public Land Development Corporation, LRF was one of the few organizations that was testifying in public meeting after public meeting, rulemaking sessions in front of the Board of Land and Natural Resources and in front of the legislature to keep the Public Land Development Corporation. Why was that?
I guess it's to have what their mission talks about, reasonable, rational, equitable land use planning and legislation. Perhaps they felt that was reasonable and rational.
Well, again, LRF, you are on the board of directors, so I don't think it's something that you can hold as arm's length from you. And so if the position then of LRF is that the Public Land Development Corporation is reasonable and rational development, can you describe how that organization was reasonable and rational development?
I think the discussion there is about the land entitlement process and how long it takes.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to LUC and zoning. And as you know, it's a lineal process. You have to go to the state land use first. There's an environmental process involved, and then you go to the county zoning process. So it's very lineal. But what I've come to understand that in the process, there's a lot of duplicative efforts. At the LUC, they're asking state and county agencies to comment. At the zoning area, they're asking state and county agencies to comment. So, in an effort of streamlining, can that be brought together to do that? I'm not sure what the PLDC was intending to do, to be quite honest with you. LRF supported it, as you say. I don't know what they said. Castle and Cook did not support the PLDC.
But you're on the board of directors of LRF
Right.
during this entire period. Okay.
So I understand what you're saying. I can't distance myself because I'm associated with them, but I can tell you that we don't account for every action that the executive director takes.
So during this period, your understanding of the Public Land Development Corporation is it was an effort to streamline and eliminate the duplication in the development entitlement process?
I don't even know that. I just know it was an attempt to streamline a process.
What was your understanding of the opposition to the Public Land Development Corporation? Because there was an awful lot of public discussion of this. I'm sure when the board of directors met once a month over this year-long period, there must have been some discussion, and you probably attended some public meetings yourself. So what did you understand was the public opposition to the PLDC?
I never attended a public meeting on this, legislative or otherwise. My understanding was someone had the notion to offer a streamlining process to do certain things like TOD. And from our side, we said, you have laws in place to do that. Why would you want to create this? So the community outrage was transparency. You have LUC in place, you have the development plans in place, you have a county process in place. Now, where does this come from now? What is PLDC about? And the suspicion is, well, and then what are you really trying to do with PLDC? Are you going to put up a condominium somewhere without going through the public process and the transparency? So I guess that was a criticism. Yeah.
So did you think it was unwarranted criticism that if you're trying to eliminate duplications of land use entitlement process, then, you know, people were unjustified in having criticism to the PLDC? Or?
No, I think they were justified, but I don't know if the PLDC was intending to streamline the duplication in the process. It was a totally separate proposal. And I think generally when you look at policy or proposal, if it doesn't make sense, it generally goes away. And that's the outcome of PLDC.
Well, I understand that it went away, but it was the outcome of PLDC over LRF's objections, of which you were on the board of directors. So let me ask you, are you aware that the PLDC law stated that all PLDC projects, and this is a government agency dealing with developments on government land, shall be exempt from all statutes, ordinances, charter provisions, and rules of any government agency relating to land use and zoning?
Well, I wasn't aware of that extent. I mean, that's why it fails. I mean, that's why that law failed.
Why was LRF lobbying to keep that law on the books if you were saying that you've never been a part of an organization that says, let's find a way to get around the law? And you're on the board of directors of LRF. Why is it lobbying to keep this law on the books that would exempt any development under the PLDC authority on any state lands from any land use law or regulation at the state or county level?
Councilor Cook never supported that law. We believe in the processes that's in place. LRF apparently took that position, and I don't know what they said, but I am part of LRF during that time. So again, my explanation is the executive director has a lot of latitude in taking positions. He did in this one.
So again, Mr. Ching, this isn't a position that the executive director just walked into a hearing and took one time. This is over something like an 12-month period with news story after news story, television, newspaper, huge public outcry on the fact that these developments are going to be exempt from all zoning and land use regulations, where LRF is repeatedly taking these positions. While you are a vice president of the organization, are you telling us that you're just completely unaware of what the executive director was doing over this period of time?
That's not what I meant. We knew LRF was taking that position, but we weren't monitoring. I wasn't monitoring it specifically. Councilor Cook didn't believe in it.
I'm not asking about Councilor Cook. You're on the board of directors of LRF. I'm asking about your position as a director of LRF.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's on all the boards I sit on, it's very macro. It would be like asking me about sitting on Polymomi and understanding some malpractice suit going on. I have no idea what's going on. It's totally macro. So when we show up at board meetings, it's a macro discussion. They may drill down on stuff in that setting, but LRF is very similar. It's very macro.
I guess I'm having a little trouble with the analogy of Polymomi and understanding something there, because under LRF's website again, LRF is the only Hawaii-based organization devoted exclusively to promoting the interests of the development community, particularly in the areas of land use laws, regulations, and public policies. So when you look through all of the LERF materials, including on the website of the bulletins that are sent out to the membership, it is all about and only about the advocacy work that the organization does around land use entitlement and protecting the interests of private landowners and developers. So it's not like saying I'm on the board of Polymomi and I don't know what's going on in a procedure. This issue of the public policy, influencing public policy decisions on land use is the reason for LERF existence.
And they've done many other things in the area of land use, impact fees and all that, but I'll have to defer to LERF. I mean, I'm not sure why they were so engaged in it.
So can we ignore David Arakawa in the future because he's acting without any of the board's oversight or authority?
That's for the LERF board to decide.
But you were on the LERF board.
No longer there. I'm not trying to distance myself. I was associated with LERF. We did many good things, I thought. We helped with the IAO law, by the way. We were engaged in there. But on this one, I mean, what you describe as a PLDC, it's carte blanche with fast track. And why would anyone want to do that without transparency, without government review?
Well, that's exactly my question, but LERF wanted to do that. LERF lobbied over an extensive period of time to keep that law on the books during the period that you were a board of directors. So when you say, why would anybody want to do it, you should have an answer being a director of that organization during that time.
I can only assume that they were trying to streamline a process.
Is bypassing all the zoning laws and land use regulations streamlining in your mind?
That's what this law was attempting to do.
So exempting developments from all statutes, ordinances, charter provisions, and rules of any government agency relating to land use and zoning is streamlining?
It's fast-tracking a process, is what that sounds like it's trying to do.
Okay.
So it's bypassing public meetings, input from state, county. I don't know if it bypasses the environmental process, but that was the intent. Fast-tracking to get to a conclusion or a result.
Can I just follow up on that? Okay. So, Carleton, do you agree with everything the Land Use Commission, the LERF stood for?
No, not always.
Does all the board agree with everything? Is that a majority rule or?
No, not always. It's not even that formal. We don't sit around and say, let's vote on this issue, yay, go, David Arakawa. It's very informal.
So is it fair to say that some members supported LERF doing that and others on the board of directors didn't, and yet perhaps the majority did? Like in our legislature, some of us don't necessarily agree with the decisions and the bills that come out?
I think that's a fair characterization of what happened there, yeah.
So at any time during this 11-plus month period, when the employee of the board of directors is going around and testifying in favor of keeping PLDC and this streamlining, did you ever do anything to demonstrate or say that you opposed what the executive director was doing regarding the PLDC?
If I say anything now, it's purely hearsay, so you would have to speak to David Arakawa on my position with this particular law.
Okay, but a minute ago you were telling me you didn't know anything about the law. Now are you implying that you were opposing the PLDC?
No, we're aware of the law. We weren't aware of what he was doing about it, but we did discuss it in general terms, and I said, we're staying away from this. It doesn't make sense. That's what I said to him personally. Now you have to confer with David to get that. But I guess the LERF position there is it was a concept of streamlining, of fast-tracking, permitting, processing to get to the end result, which is housing, I guess. But it's such a far-reaching proposal that it imploded. I mean, bad policy and bad law sometimes takes its own course of action.
So did you think the PLDC was about housing?
That's what I assumed it was. I have no idea.
So,
Yeah.
do you understand that under that law, the law tasks the PLDC to assist developmental, recreational, and visitor-related enterprises conduct promotional strategies to strengthen the position of these enterprises to better exploit local, national, and international markets?
You got to go back to who authored that law and what the purpose was. I assume it was to fast track the process that we're involved in developing homes. Now it sounds like much more than that. And
So when LERF is taking a position on this, and you're a member of the board of directors, and you see that there is a significant public outcry against the law, and it's very unusual for the legislature to repeal the law 2 years after passing it. So this was a significant public debate, and your organization is taking a position to try and retain the law in the face of all this opposition. Did you ever take any efforts yourself to educate yourself on what the opposition was, to bring the matter up in front of the board of directors, to make some effort to guide the employee and what the position was going to be by the board?
other than what I've explained to you, everyone, I believe, was well aware of the public criticism. And so let it take its course and see what it was a huge effort to pass it, and then a huge effort to repeal it. And now that you read it in that context, I can see why.
Well, it's not the context I'm reading it in. That was what was in the law from the beginning. In that same legislative session that LERF was lobbying to keep the PLDC on the books, it was also taking a position on another law, which also granted full exemptions for projects from zoning, land use, and permitting requirements at the county level. This is the Public-Private Partnership Authority.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one.
In your mind, is exemption of projects from zoning, land use, and permitting requirements come under the definition of streamlining?
It could be from LERF's perspective, sure. But you know, again, from wearing my Castle and Cook hat, we know the LUC process, we know the zoning process is predictable, we comply with that.
Okay, I'm not speaking to your Castle and Cook hat, I'm speaking to your hat as a member of the board of directors of the Land Use Research Foundation. Most of the opposition that you heard about today, and if you read the testimony, is relating to your role on the Land Use Research Foundation and the positions that you have taken as a member of the board of directors there. It's not nearly as much concern about your tenure at Castle and Cook, I think, as about the other. I'm going to open it up to some other questions before I continue. Mr. Song, or Senator Song, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Now, this was such an interesting discussion, though, especially since I remember that there was such strong legislative support for PLDC. I, of course, voted no, and I campaigned against it for 2 years. But there was strong support, not only from LERF, but from other organizations in this community. So I think we should keep that in perspective. We've talked a lot about balance this afternoon. And I know that some people look at DLNR as the major function is preservation of different things, different lands, different customs, and so forth. But there is a component of development, and particularly when we're talking so much always about housing and the need for housing. What's your view on any balance between development and preservation in DLNR?
The DLNR owns a lot of state lands along the rails as an example. So I guess one would have to look at each asset on a case-by-case basis. Is it appropriate to use it for some economic benefit, i.e. affordable housing? Is it appropriate to keep it in conservation? What's that balance? And so I would say an asset would be case by case. You have to look at it carefully and what it is doing for the agency and that asset.
Okay. Mr. Purcell attends a lot of different hearings in different agencies, and he's raised the question about Oahu-centric and the use of technology before, and I think he brings up a good point. What are your views on bringing the neighbor islands more closely into the debates, making it easier to facilitate their discussion and input, whether it's video conferencing or something else?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because my first session with the DLNR team, I noticed the big screens there and asked if that's being used for engagement from the outer islands when you have a board meeting on Oahu. I'm not sure if it's in place yet. And then vice versa, does the board during the off legislative session take their meetings to other counties to get engagement that way? So I think it's important to have neighbor island engagement. I'm not sure how they're doing it now, what efficiencies they use.
Will you work towards it if
Yes,
you're nominated?
Yes.
Confirmed?
Yes, I will.
Final question. You're here on a job interview. We've got stacks and stacks of paper of people that say that they're against you. Why should we hire you?
Without being redundant of the things you heard today, you have to believe that I'm the right person for that job. You have to believe that I can bring my skill set to help it, manage it in a way that can move it along, not knowing the detail of every division or every specialty, because you have to rely on that. So, do you view me as the fox watching the hen house or the bulldog guarding the house is the question I have for you. And that's the decision you have to make. Working for different companies have given me a great baseline of managing projects, programs, budgets, working with people, collaborating. This chairperson position is a macro level management job, working with 10 divisions. Last I counted, 18 different reports, programs, working with them, helping them along where you can, offering constructive points if you can, to be the best we can over here at DLNR, to protect our land and natural resources, and to ask the questions. The beauty of coming into a new organization is you can ask the hard questions. How come you're doing it this way? And why not this way? And what about this way? And don't you see that this may look inappropriate to some people's eyes? I just came from the private side. You know, everyone looks at civil service people, 8 to 5. Not from what I've seen at DLNR. Committed people, dedicated staff. So it's what you think I can bring to that position. And can I work with the DLNR, Water Commission, and all the divisions that are part of the DLNR?
And we also have to believe you when you say that, in fact, if there were a conflict or a perceived conflict, you would, in fact, recuse yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chief. Thank you, Chair.
Les, I'm sorry, I was trying to go in order.
Oh, okay.
So-
Let's see. I see one of the editorials mentioned that there was a question about whether DLNR under your leadership would be too development friendly with your friends on LERF and so forth. I think that's a theme and a concern that, and I think think Common Cause might have raised it too, a concern about giving landowners or developers unfair advantage. Could you address that concern?
The lens has changed. You work for the state now, so I don't know what kind of advantage do you move their application to the top of the stack?
I think it's maybe giving them more access. I think that the bottom line concern is, if you change your uniform, you may still have your undershirt with your old, you have to change the entire uniform, and I think the concern might be that there may be some remnants of the old uniform, and so I just want to, there's more of a fear, so if you can just address that.
Well, I think coming from that side of the industry prepares me better to watch for hidden agendas and special needs, and watching out just for those traps. But it's compliance to law. So if A or B or C developer or landowner walks in with a request of DLNR, here's our law, comply with it. I think that's what you have to do. And how I address the unwarranted criticism is by my action. So in that light, if Harry Saunders walked in with something for Castle and Cook, stand in line. Here's the staff that you work with. This is what you have to do. So it's no preferential treatment to anyone, but I think it gives me the lens to see where agendas might be coming in for special interests. Now that works two ways now. Other people have special interests as well when they approach the department. I'm sure they do. So having the antenna up for that I think is important.
Good for now.
Senator Cahill. I'm sorry. Too many gills on this Senate.
Great, thank you. I wanted to, if we could talk a little bit about water. You'd be the chair of the Water Commission, right? So there's a few issues there I think that are important, and I think we should address them. And I believe, if I understand you correctly, you're a big believer in property rights, the right to use your property as you can. Do you have any thoughts on how water rights and property rights kind of overlay?
I think the law is very clear. The Water Commission, I'm trying to find that now, my apologies. And it is to protect that, basically it's to protect that natural and precious resource for the benefit of all. So it's clear what the Water Commission has to do. I know very contentious issues when you are talking about the use of water and the restoration of the stream flow and all that stuff, but it has to be that balance in there. You have a very professional staff in there. You have a lot of collaboration that's necessary. You have the technicians and the scientists to tell you what exactly is happening in an aquifer or a particular source. And you have to drive for that sweet spot. What's the right thing to do with that precious water resource? And so it's not denying anyone its rights to use it, but it's finding out how you can share and balance that use somehow.
So you'd mentioned that a couple of, somewhere in all this I read, Castle and Cook has a couple of properties on the leeward side. I believe Royal Kunia maybe, or wasn't there a few developments that Castle and Cook was involved with?
Right,
on that side?
yeah.
And where do they get the majority of their water? Is that, is it from wells, or do you know where it comes from?
As far as I know, it's domestic water from city and county. They have a share of the Waihole ditch water, and it's used for their farming tenants.
Okay.
So none of that water is used for development. They apply to the BWS for domestic water, and in some cases they actually have to go and develop a source or a infrastructure system to deliver that water.
Okay. So I guess where I want to get with this is, I guess, how do you consider and organize questions? I mean, what metrics are you going to use to make these determinations, or how are you going to get there when there's disputes over stream flows and user rights and appurtenant rights. And how do you get there? What's the trump card? How do you figure it out?
I think you have to rely on the expertise of your staff to take you through a process and come to a conclusion that the Water Commission can look at and make a decision that is fair and balanced somehow. But the chairman has to work with their board and the Water Commission. I don't believe the chairman has a discretionary right to just trump something and say, we're going to do this. Now, I believe in a board setting, you can opine, you can provide your input, comments, but it still goes back to the law, the expertise of the staff, the stakeholders who are there collaborating or discussing an issue to find that.
So you don't anticipate being very proactive in the Water Commission, or
I think
you get to pick your deputy. Yeah.
This position has to be active in the Water Commission as well as the board. So that in itself is quite a management challenge to cover the boards and the commissions, right?
So on the Waihole case that was settled 15 years ago or so, do you know do you have any insight as to the repercussions of restoring the stream flow and how that affected the environment? Have you had a chance to study that or learn up on that?
I'm not familiar with the Waihole water case. I'm sorry. I long past my time when I was at HHA. We were primarily there to develop.
It didn't perk your ears when you heard Waihole. You didn't say, "Oh, I used to work there."
Yeah, different scenario at that time. But I do know that the community on that side wanted to protect their stream flow, and that was very important for them. And I believe they prevailed in doing that.
Why do you think it was so important for them?
Because for the cultural practices, many of them, as Mr. Ho said, were trying to open up Lo'ois to terraform. And a lot of them was natural, free-flowing water in the Waihole stream that they wanted to have. And they wanted to maintain the Waihole stream actually runs right to Kaneohe Bay, so they wanted to maintain that stream flow for the ecosystem in there. So that was important for them, I know.
Yeah, clearly. That's water is important on that side. And then last area questions, or last question in this area was what do you think about climate change? And what are we to do about that? Or what direction do you think the department may need to go, or measures it may need to address regarding
I think it's
freshwater, rising elevations?
It's a very important issue, climate
thoughts?
change. I know when I met with Sam Lemo briefly, he explained how critical it is for shoreline, for rising sea level, just the whole ecosystem. But the challenge is the baseline and the science behind it, and finding out what that metrics is. I know there's a lot of different discussion on that now. And then when we find that baseline, then what do we do about it? What's the preventive measures to address some of the effects of climate change?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Carleton, we've heard what you're not going to do, what you're not supposed to do, what you plan on not doing. I want to know what you're going to do. Because obviously the rules are stating that you're not going to do things to the conservation lands. Now, let's talk about, if we may, highest and best. Okay. Because those are the shirts or the shorts or whatever it is that we want you to continue using. You got skills that the governor asked you to come in to execute. Okay. As an example, we got harbors. Okay. One of them is in my district. It's called Alawai. It's pretty despicable about what it looks like after a big rain, We've talked a lot of smack about public-private partnerships in this conversation. And I admit, absolutely, streamlining it to the point of PLDC might not have been the right thing to do. But I don't think we disagree that public-private partnerships are what's going to carry the day for us in many cases. Now, specifically to the point of those partnerships, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with the harbors? Let's be specific for it. We've been flying at 30,000 feet. maybe we can come down a little bit more, but at least for my questioning.
Well, again, without speaking with the staff directly and trying to identify what they said in their 2015 report of objectives, I think you got to explore those concepts where appropriate. Private interests has their own interests and agenda. We got to make real sure that they comply with our agenda to help us with a facility. So can we generate more revenue from a small boat harbor or a land asset or a lease of some kind? I would say very much so we can. But is it appropriate to do it at that location? And at what costs? So you got to analyze these assets on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I think people would love to see improvements at Hawaii Harbor. Who's going to pay for it? What's the income generated for the benefit of the state? And how we're going to use that benefit? Are we going to put it back into the harbor system and say, okay, this one is the cash revenue generator, and this is our sweet spot, and we're going to take this and move it to all the small boat harbors to improve all the harbors. So you begin to wonder how we do that per facility. And I always say where it's appropriate, because private interest has their own agenda many times.
You speak private English, you speak private interest language.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why I think the governor asked you to come and work for the state. And you stated that you can change clothes, but there's going to be points in there where you got to bring that expertise in.
That's true.
You would agree, right?
Yes.
Okay. So in the private boardrooms, you understand the nuances of that conversation, because you're going to have to do it on our behalf now.
Yes.
You do it on our behalf. You work for us if we confirm you.
Right.
You understand that clearly.
Yes, I do. And it's clear with the expertise of the staff, in this case, the Small Boat Harbor Land Division, that they are looking out for the best interests of the state.
So in the event that there's a good public-private partnership for, say, LOI, you will advise the governor as such. It's a good investment.
If it's been analyzed appropriately, if it is an appropriate partnership with a private entity, if they have the correct track record, credit, history of doing this kind of stuff, by all means, we could make a proposal to the governor and say this might be a good one to engage with. But also often I see in the private side, we hear these people coming to town promising this and that, and they want a cheap lease to encourage some kind of development activity, and the activity never shows up. So what are we left with? Vacant asset or underutilized asset. So we want to be real careful in enticing private entities to come, because they have to meet our agenda. Now, I understand what their agenda will be, but they have to meet our agenda to engage with us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Senator Ludeman?
Thank you. A few more questions, Mr. Ching. You mentioned a little while ago about we were talking about ag land and putting ag land into use, or if we're going to decide that a parcel is important for ag land, then people need to use it and grow some food, kind of a use it or lose it sort of thing. Right? What about the fact that if we develop it, that the opportunity to lose it, to use it, is lost forever? Because that's part of the paradigm you need to enforce and champion in DLNR. It's not what are we going to do, get out of it this year. It's how we're going to take care of it forever. So I've twice heard you refer to land as a piece of dirt, and somebody needs to use it. We need to get something out of it, or it's not fair to keep it. How do you address that in the context of DLNR's mission to preserve, protect?
Yeah, again, it's a case-by-case basis, depending on the asset. If it's a stranded asset that has produced income in the past and it's sitting there fallow, vacant for whatever reason, then it might make sense to re-engage that effort to seek new revenue generating opportunities if it's a stranded asset. If it's a valuable cultural site, watershed site, forest site, it's maybe a no-touch asset. And then the question is, how do you maintain it? And can you put resources to maintain it in the level that we need to maintain it, or are you just driving for a deferred maintenance program where eventually you're playing catch up?
Okay. I want to ask you some questions about your background. And forgive me if they seem like tough questions. It's kind of something Senator Sloan say, I want you to give me a reason to support your nomination. And I want to preface these questions by explaining why. Almost everyone that's talked today who knows you talks about you're a very nice man, honest, capable in your field, and with high integrity. No one is disparaging that. But I want to talk about your qualifications for this job. And the reason why I feel a certain need to do it, I need to explain this so it doesn't feel like I'm being harsh on you. About 80% of DLNR lands I've heard are on the Big Island, where I live. My current email count is over 1,000 opposed to your confirmation, 13 in favor. It's in addition to what we see in front of us, which is similar numbers in some ways. It's unprecedented opposition to confirmation in my limited experience. It's certainly unlike any other nomination we've had this year. And it's unlike it in several senses. Our nominees for tax department has experience in tax. Our nominees for ag department has experience in ag. Our nominee for attorney general has experience in the law. But the DLNR's core mission is about preservation and protection. And I want to ask you some questions to demonstrate your interest in, if not experience in, conservation and preservation. When you served on Land Use Research Foundation, was that a paid position or was that a volunteer position?
Oh, they're all volunteer
It's
boards.
volunteer?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever, can you give me any example where you similarly volunteered or in any way for any organization that was involved with preservation or conservation?
No, other than the ones I listed, no. They were
Which ones? I'm sorry, which ones?
the 5 boards I sat on were Land Use Research Foundation, the BIA, Palimomi Hospital, HPU, Hawaii Pacific University, and Pacific Housing Assistance, which is a nonprofit low-income housing developer.
So am I correct that either in your volunteer work or in your professional experience you've never been involved with an organization that's devoted to conservation or preservation?
The explanation I provided shows that the different companies I worked for had conservation programs in place. Now, as part of the management team, we were aware of the strategies and the programs, but I was not hands-on. So I was part of the Cast Cook management team that had a conservation program on Lanai, as an example. We were very aware of that. On Cast Cook, we had conservation lands we had to maintain. And then I cite on Molokai Ranch where I was more hands-on. We did conserve and preserve a lot of the sites that we had on Molokai. And on Molokai, that was a little bit more hands-on because I had direct reports there.
Okay, thank you. In the people who have opposed your nomination, we have about 20 environmental groups. Some of them are rather major groups like Sierra Club, Outdoor Circle, Surfrider. Are there any such groups that have supported your nomination to your knowledge?
Environmental groups?
Preservation groups, conservation groups?
Not that I know of, other than what I heard today from the different groups that were represented today.
Okay. So LERF, in addition to things like the PLDC, LERF has rather actively opposed designation, for example, of critical habitat. Do you understand what I mean by critical habitat? What is that? Can you explain to me what it is?
It's an area that's designated for, preservation because it has, critical issues in there. Either invasive, endangered species, specific plant that's endangered, so general species, critical habitats. I'm referring to the one I know on Lanai, where we had a critical habitat up in the Lanai Hale, where we had the birds that were roosting on the ground. So that was a critical habitat that we had to preserve and protect with fencing.
So LERF has lobbied pretty hard against critical habitat to reduce it, to allow more readily allow development. Do you agree with that position by LERF?
I don't know what detail in which they're opposing critical habitats. But I know LERF is not opposed to protecting historical and cultural sites and critical habitats. So I don't know what degree that they're opposing it.
Well, they opposed it by opposing the Fish and Wildlife, trying to reduce the critical habitat designations. This kind of gets back to one of my pet concerns, which is endangered species. As I understand it, the way to save an endangered species is to preserve its habitat. That comes down to intact native ecosystems. I don't think you can preserve an endangered species in reality without preserving its habitat. So that's what critical habitat is to me. LERF also, as well as BIA, has lobbied against the Historic Preservation Division, which we've discussed a little bit in regards to that little logo they put out. Did you ever express any concerns about LERF doing that? I mean, did you ever express that maybe that wasn't the right thing to do? Or do you have any concern about your advocacy for that?
Well, I sat on the BIA board for a short time in 2014 last year, and I was aware of the issue. And as I explained it, because they have a lot of small business and contractors, the problem that was surfacing were small handyman, repairman trying to fix 50-year-old structures. A roof is the classic example. And in doing so, going to the city to get a permit and having that permit immediately ejected to SHPTA for historic review when it was simply a repair of a 50-year-old Hicks home, if you will. So that's what I understand BIA was trying to address, not the removal of protecting cultural and historical sites.
So the logo that I've seen two versions of now with a big X sign over SHPD, should that not be interpreted as saying let's do away with the Historic Preservation Division? I mean, is that misleading in that regard?
It certainly is if you're looking at it that way, but I think as the BIA executive director explained, it was their method to bring awareness to it. And they have the opportunity with the various programs they run to bring awareness to the different issues. And I know at their remodeling event last year, they had a booth on that. And the education was just that. How old is your home? I believe the card said, how old is your home? Do you know that you have to get this permit because it's that old? But yes, they use that thing to bring awareness to them. But I don't believe they were ever trying to oppose not protecting historical and cultural sites.
You don't think that was meant to oppose the sheer existence of the Historic Preservation Division?
I don't believe so, no. They were trying to address that 50-year-old repair rule. So when I met with Kristen Faulkner, Historic Sites, that's her accusation. I called BIA, Gladys. I said, she's thinking you want to abolish it. Oh, no, we're not. Well, can you guys talk about this? Well, how are you going to resolve it? Well, we're going to go to the ledge and fight it out. I said, why don't you guys work it out before you go to the ledge? Is the conversation I had with Gladys Monroe. She's not here.
Okay.
To reach out is all, right? Because that was a scare by Kirsten Faulkner that the BIA and all its power was trying to implode the law, and that was never the case, is what I understood.
LRF has successfully lobbied to require the DOH to delete various protections involving Native Hawaiian rights, coastal zone management, and environmental impact reviews. Do you agree with that position?
No, I don't know the particulars behind that statement, but you know, again, it's law, it's process. So unless they were concerned about a process that wasn't working, I can't say for certain why they opposed it.
LRF has almost annually lobbied to weaken the chapter of state law that requires environmental impact statements. Did you ever express any concern while you're on the board of LRF that maybe we shouldn't oppose environmental impact statements, environmental impact reviews?
I was never understood that LRF was trying to reduce the EIS law. Perhaps their method was to look at how you can clarify some of the issues. We say, Carleton Cook says we comply with the laws, and if it requires an EIS and it triggers an EIS, we will do that.
LRF has been lobbying against land use protection in the form of land use commission for 10 years or more. Have you ever expressed any concern about that?
Again, I'm not aware of their particular lobbying efforts against the land use commission. By LRF, excuse me.
Do you agree that the director of DLNR has to kind of be a champion for the environment?
Absolutely.
How will you do that? What in your life, what in your experience, what in your aptitude is going to enable you to be that champion that we so desperately need?
I think the driving motive is our mission statement. It's clear what you have to do. It's protecting and conserving and managing and enhancing our land and natural resources. That is the, if you will, job description, if you don't have one for this position. That's the job description. So every division has their own specific mission statement, and it all ties into the broad mission statement. So without micromanaging each division and each action they take, it has to be guided and focused in that. Every decision we make is about protecting and enhancing, and when inherent conflicts come up, then we ought to look at them real closely and figure out why these conflicts are here, and who we can get in the room to collaborate and find the right answer or the sweet spot to resolve this.
You've already mentioned that, I think you mentioned that if issues come up regarding specifically Castle and Cook, for example, that you might recuse yourself from some of the decision making. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How will you engender a atmosphere among your subordinates to oppose what has been your business interests for decades? How will you allow them to feel comfortable making objective decisions that you might personally disapprove of based on your friends and allies?
Well, no, it's all about collaboration and listening to your team. It's listening to your team and understanding what their law dictates, what their mission dictates, what they're trying to do to move their programs forward. I think it's healthy dialogue when we can engage with staff, and if we have a disagreement, to flesh that out and figure what it is. So I expect that team, who is a dedicated team, to say, hey man, this is ugly. Why are you doing this? And I expect you to say the same thing. Why are you going there when it doesn't meet your mission? That dialogue has to happen at that level. And before you bring anything as an agenda item, I would assume, to the board, that item has been fairly well vetted internally before you make any presentation to the board and the Water Commission. And again, the reliance on the staff is critical to this, right?
How will you deal with, we've heard a couple of times today, trust in government, faith in government, separate from actual conflicts of interest, perceptions of conflict of interest, and perception regarding trust in government, trust in our processes are very important. How will you deal with perceptions of conflicts of interest?
Be very transparent about it. If it appears that way, you can disclose it. You can ask the Department Attorney General. You can ask your division heads. To that, does this appear to be a conflict? And in my mind, if there's any appearance of a conflict, then it's inappropriate. It's a conflict. So the safest thing to do is to recuse yourself from the discussion. It's not just a Catholic Cook conflict. It could be any development conflict. Because I worked in industry and I know different people, it could be all of those conflicts. The flip side to that is the board meets twice a month. The Water Commission meets frequently. You have to have some efficiency built in for that board. So if you have a quorum and you can recuse, all good. But if you have a hot item that needs action, and I would say only in the case of extreme public health and safety, you may have to look at it in a different light. Castle Cook has to do something right away because the dam broke or something. And I only have four members there at that meeting, and I recuse and we can't take action to the next week. Well, I think in that case, if it's emergency, health and safety, you may want to say, it's a conflict, but this is about health and safety. And that owner has to take action right away, needing our approval. So again, it's case by case, I would say, but health and safety has to be critical.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
So, Mr. Ching, I want to maybe come at the questions I had in a slightly different angle. Maybe before my questions, though, it would help if you clarified first, because at the beginning when you were talking about the sweet spot, it sounded like there was kind of one way of viewing what was permissible and what should be done with state land, and then another way for private land. And so maybe you can clarify for us, first off, what is your understanding of the public trust responsibility and the differences between public land and private land?
Well, I guess the simplest explanation is if it's state-owned public lands, then we have a specific value to maintain. The public trust doctrine dictates what that is. It's for the benefit of everyone. I would assume private landowners could comply with that as well, if they choose to, or if they're not complying with law, we can force that issue with them. But finding the sweet spot for anything simply means finding the right solution and bringing parties together to do that. Yeah.
But going back to that public trust doctrine as far as the difference between the public lands and the private lands. So you're saying that we would maintain that public trust doctrine value on public lands and I don't want to be putting words in your mouth, actually, I have the question. Are you saying that it's optional for a private landowner to adopt those values, but if they don't want to adopt them, the minimum is that they comply with the law?
Well, I think that applies to, I mean, it's state constitution, so it applies to all our lands, doesn't it?
Well, that's what I'm asking you, what
Okay,
your
well,
understanding, because it sounded to me from your earlier questions, answers, that there was a distinction between public and private land. So I just want to understand what your thinking is on that.
Well, my distinction was private landowners have a different approach to using their lands, highest and best use, economic value, versus what we would use it for.
Mm-hmm.
Different measures of margins and benefits. But this complies statewide to everyone, so they would have to comply.
With the public trust doctrine?
Sure.
Okay.
I would assume so, yes.
Okay. Now, while you may or may not be aware of it, during your tenure on the board of directors at LERF, your organization came into the legislature, and contrary to my trusty vice chair, I was not talking smack about public-private partnerships, but about exemptions. During your tenure on the board of directors, LERF was actively lobbying this legislature on a number of bills between 2006 and 2013 to exempt development from special management area permits and from the Land Use Commission. And these are two procedures which developments have to go through, and people can argue whether they're duplicative or not, but there's a certain things that are looked at under those entitlement processes at the Land Use Commission and the Special Management Area Permit. What is your understanding of the roles and the objectives of either of those processes, the Land Use Commission or the Special Management Area Permit?
I think the land use entitlement process is very important.
Well, I'm talking about those particular
Okay.
reviews of developments.
So land use
Use Commission
Yeah.
or Special Management Area Permit. What is your understanding of the roles of those permits and the objectives of those?
I think they're very
processes?
important. That's a process that provides the vetting, the reviews, the merits of the project that you have to present to the different agencies that have oversight there. So the LUC is a very intense process. You apply, you petition to do these things, you have to present your case. It's vetted in a quasi-judicial process. It's very intense.
So relating to the public trust doctrine, are there specific things that those processes are required to take a look at for the developments on private lands?
I think each process has their criteria to review. I know the LUC has a set criteria in reviewing any change of land use designation. And I believe one of the criteria is, cultural resource. So there is some overlap in the LUC side. I'm not sure if special management permits do that. I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Okay, but are you familiar with any of those processes where they're looking at particular public trust doctrines in making decisions regarding developments on private lands?
I think the LUC does. I think that's part of their view when they look at any LUC change.
So what is it that is your understanding that they're taking a look at? How would they be?
Well, I would say, I'm just reading the doctrine now, I would say that they're looking at all the natural resources of the permitted area. And does it promote the development and using the resources in a proper method? And does it further conserve and furtherance of self-sufficiency? So those general tenets, I think, are part of that criteria that LUC uses.
Mm-hmm.
So I recall there are several distinct criteria that they use to determine how you change land use designation. One of them is preservation of agricultural sites, if I recall. Yeah.
So you've been in Hawaii for a long time. You probably recall, I think it was back in the late 80s, early 90s, Nansei was looking at doing a 1,000-acre hotel, golf course, clubhouse, resort, and development along the coast of the Big Island. And in seeking a special management area permit, the rights of the traditional and cultural practitioners to access the areas were denied on the grounds that they had no rights distinct from ordinary citizens. And that was appealed all the way up to the Hawaii Supreme Court and ultimately became the Pash decision. The Land Use Research Foundation made the effort of hiring an attorney, I guess, and filing an amicus brief arguing against the rights of traditional and cultural practices and the rights to access the area. Are you familiar with the decision and the role that the special management area permit takes vis-a-vis the rights of traditional and cultural practitioners?
Not in detail, no. I know it's a very important permit you have to get though for use in a special zone area.
So earlier you were talking about how, somebody was saying, yeah, you can get there, but you can't walk through my home. But I mean, in this case, we were talking about 1,000-acre development and access to the coastline at all in the area to places of traditional and cultural practices. If you abolish or exempt developments from the special management area permit, how do you protect those practices?
Why would we abolish the SMP? I don't understand.
Earlier we were talking about the Public Land Development Corporation and the other bills that LERF had proposed in front of the legislature, and you termed them streamlining.
Right.
It's making the entitlement process more efficient. Those efforts were to exempt private and public development from permits like the special management area permit on the grounds that entitlement is duplicative and lengthy. So if you don't have those permits in place, how do you protect the traditional and cultural practices?
I think you have to maintain those permits then in that case. To protect the cultural practices. I'm not familiar with the Nansei case details, but I know it's important to make sure you have access for those practices. I don't know why they took that position.
Why is it important to have access to those practices?
Because the practitioners have used that to sustain their families.
Is there any other reason
It's
that you...
historical, it's cultural, it's what they do, they teach that way, they walk down to that same path.
Is there any legal reason why you need to maintain those practices?
Yeah, don't we have, I'm just trying to recall what we are required to do in development. I know when we develop on the shoreline, you have to maintain access to the shoreline, right? So I know there's laws in place to do that. Yeah.
Are you aware that there's also a constitutional requirement to protect traditional and cultural practices?
That's generally what I was referring to. I don't know the details of it though. I know where I live in Kaneohe, we have access to the shoreline that was required of the developer who developed it. So there's access right from the street to the,
And are you familiar with what are the laws that, or the mechanism that's used to make sure that developments on the shoreline area do protect traditional and cultural access as well as general public access?
I'm not familiar with the details, no. I would have to defer to the staff to make sure we're complying.
Are you aware that it's the very permits that the Land Use Research Foundation and your organization during your tenure on the board came into the legislature to try and exempt development from?
I wasn't aware of that.
Why?
As I explained earlier, that we don't micromanage the executive director. He has the latitude to do and take positions on many things. He is guided by our mission statement. So he makes the decision to go and comment and take a position on many issues. So I don't know what the details are behind that particular position from LERF.
Well, again, it's not a particular position. These are positions that have been taken. I mean, if you want, I can go through the list of bills where LERF has taken these positions, but it's been pretty constant during your entire 10-year period on the board of directors. And I guess I'm a little confused if you've been involved in development on the business side as well as on the volunteer side on the Land Use Research Foundation board of directors. How is it that you weren't aware, time and again, of the organizations, and these are the very organizations that have come up to testify against your nomination for this very reason, of their objections and public dismay and explanation of why these entitlement processes are necessary, and their objections to the repeated efforts to streamline or eliminate the very permit systems that protect these rights?
My management oversight with Castle Cook is in the community and government relations side, so-called lobbying, community outreach. So when we have a project, we generally defer to the development management team and the attorneys to look at all the applicable laws, all the requirements to be met for particular projects. So I'm not engaged in all the particulars. I'm not. The general statement is we comply with state and county laws.
I guess I understand that you comply, but you've also been part of an effort over a significant period of time to change those laws. And I guess that's what I'm trying to understand, is how could you, I mean, it says in your materials that you're very good at listening, that you understand when there's conflict, that you're able to reach out to people and to start to dialogue with them. You've been on the Land Use Research Foundation board for nearly 10 years, nearly a decade, and these disputes have been relatively constant, session after session, in front of the legislature, in front of the county councils, and the various ordinances that LERF has weighed in on and advocated for or against, and it goes to the very heart of these, not just the public trust resources, but the constitutional obligations for traditional and cultural practices, and the public right to access public lands like the shoreline. And the fight is always centered around these discretionary public processes where the permits, like the Land Use Commission, like the Special Management Area Permit under the Shoreline Protection Act, those are the vehicles that are designed to protect these rights. And those are the very vehicles that time and again, during your tenure on the board of directors, LERF has attempted to eliminate on the basis of calling it streamlining and development efficiencies. How could you not be aware that people were saying you can't take away these very processes because then you're going to take away the constitutional rights of people to access these areas?
I was not aware of the details, to be quite honest with you.
Details? I'm sorry, but we're talking constitutional rights.
Well, if on the position of the chair, then it's to protect our laws and processes in place to protect public doctrine. So you speak of changing lands, then that's what I'll have to do. If you're associating me with LERF taking those positions during my tenure with LERF, I wasn't aware of all the details and the effects. Now, as this position, you would have to defend the law to make sure those processes are protected.
I know it's getting late and we have at least one member who has a bus to catch. So at this point, I think what I'm going to ask if we can take a short recess and let me confer with my members about what we want to do at this point.
Sure.
So we're going to...
One question, please. Just really quick. Why Boise State or not UH?
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute recess and we'll be right back. Okay, we are back in session. So the committee's had a chance to confer, and we each have some more questions to ask, but it is almost 7 o'clock now. We have been going since 10 o'clock this morning. So what we're going to do is recess, and we'll be coming back tomorrow. Is 1 o'clock all right with you, Mr. Ching? Are you free?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So we will be reconvening tomorrow in this room 229 at 1 o'clock to complete the questioning and then go into our deliberations. So with that, thank you everybody for all your patience. Have a good evening, and we'll see some of you tomorrow.